Defense Secretary Leon Panetta was back on Capitol Hill again earlier today for yet another round of hearings on the defense budget. Now, Panetta said that the nation's debt is a major national security issue, but warned lawmakers against any additional cuts to the Pentagon budget. The military is already planning to slash about $487 billion over the next decade, but that's nowhere near enough to fix the budget deficit. Of course, Panetta insisted that money would have to be found elsewhere. Here's the Defense Secretary at yesterday's Senate budget hearing.
Now, if you're not dealing with the two-thirds, that's entitlement spending. If you're not dealing with revenues and you keep going back to the same place, frankly, you're not going to make it. And you're going to hurt this country. You're going to hurt this country's security.
All right, well, is that the case, hurting this country's security? With me to break it all down is retired Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Shaffer. He is also the author of Operation Dark Heart and a senior fellow at the Center of Advanced Defense Studies. Welcome back to the program. It's great to have you.
Good to have you.
The prevailing logic seems to be money in equals military might, money out equals national security threats. Do you buy this logic?
No, I don't. There's two problems with that. First off, we're still dealing with an infrastructure which was put together, and here we are in RT, during the Cold War. So we've never stepped forward past that paradigm. So you're talking about a system which is completely outmoded for what it's supposed to do now. Secondly, we have yet to actually understand all the money, all the things we're spending money on. The F-35, for example, the Navy version can't be used because it can't trap. It can't land on an aircraft carrier. So you're talking about huge corruption of nothing else, intellect within the Pentagon, not looking at what the real threats are or how we're going to build capabilities to defend those threats. So we're right now at a time when you see the infrastructure itself, the Pentagon brass, all digging their heels and saying we can't do anything more. They're not thinking, they're pretending we're playing a game of checkers, and not understanding we have to play chess. We have to be smarter, we have to define the threats, and then build capability around those threats, not just continue to throw money at whatever we think we need to have.
Now, Tony, I mean, you're not some left-wing, anti-war activist.
I'm a Reagan Republican.
You have experience with the military. You understand how these things work, but most Americans haven't necessarily served in the military, don't necessarily know what war feels like. Most lawmakers don't necessarily have direct military experience. So when the head of the Pentagon comes and says, guys, we need this money, otherwise it's a huge threat, I mean, how do you cut through that? Isn't the Pentagon in a position to sort of manipulate?
Oh, they are. They manipulated President Obama to select the option he did for Afghanistan, which we're all seeing the results of that now. And the other thing they're doing right now is actually you have the Democrats and Republicans, and you have the bureaucracy. So the Pentagon has a huge bureaucracy that thinks for itself, and the momentum of that third party, if you will, is huge, and they own the territory. So when they go in and talk to Secretary Panetta and say X, Y, Z, what are you going to do? There's no B team or red team looking at what they're saying to actually discern if it's the truth or not. So we've got to take a hard step to look at what the truth is regarding what our requirements are. And again, not just accept what the Pentagon's saying, because a lot of these folks have vested interest in having money come in to build their empire and keep the status quo as it is.
And I do want to get into those threats, but very briefly. I mean, military manufacturing, one fact that I found here, is 123% greater today than it was in 2000. Okay, this is more than doubled, while the rest of the manufacturing sector has shrunk. Given that we do have sort of this unfortunate military-industrial complex, so to speak, are we at a point now where removing that, where making these cuts, could actually devastate the U.S. economy in the short term? Well,
that's exactly why the super committee didn't work. You had Patty Murray in Washington and Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania, who wouldn't do the big defense cuts because of Boeing. So you're seeing folks with overlapping loyalties here, and that's why we've got to have someone come in who is totally objective and say these are the things we need to focus on and get the politicians and the bureaucrats out of the way. Maybe a commission, maybe something else, but you're absolutely correct. We've got to look at this. A friend of mine, Jerry Doyle, calls it a combat to commerce, where we've actually become so wet on having these defense industries come in with big budget items, and it does keep the economy humming, but not for the right reasons.
And what are these threats? I mean, we're hearing about Iran all the time. We're hearing about the threat of China. I mean, are these valid threats? These are the two most popular, I guess, bogeymen in U.S. foreign policy right now.
Let's be honest here. The North Koreans, the Iranians are equal threats in that they understand brinksmanship and understand how to walk up to the line and make us flinch every time. The North Koreans are doing it again today.
But equal threats that merit defense spending or diplomacy spending?
I think the diplomacy should always be the first option as a warrior. Ultimately, warriors don't want to fight. Our job is to not fight if we can avoid it. With that said, I think we need to have a very strong military, which is focused on the real issues. I believe Straits of Hormuz should be kept open. I think the U.S., for better or for worse, has always defended lines of commerce and that sort of thing. But you don't need to have the scope and breadth of defense bases, forward bases that we have now. So again, we need to look at what's real. What are the real threats? What could the Iranians do at this point in time? No one can really define that. And I'm one that says, I think they've already got the bombs. So what? We've got to figure out a way to prevent a larger issue of a Sunni-Shia Cold War where nuclear weapons are developed on both sides. No one's looking at that. And this is where we've got to figure out what the real issues are, and we haven't done that.
Right, and then that is a huge threat. Now, very briefly on the North Korea issue, I mean, do you see this as evidence of diplomacy working, or do you think it's just...
Well, look, I don't think it's, I think it's one of those things is wishful thinking. The North Koreans, the Hermit Kingdom, have always been about one thing, regime survival. As long as you understand that, you understand everything else they do. I think this is one more time that we're going to try to get them to do something they don't want to do, and it's a sham, honestly.
Not so you don't think they're actually going to
I don't think so. No, they're not going to give it up. But then again, they've been contained for the past, since '54.
Right.
Nothing tells me they're going to change that anytime soon. So.
And, well, very briefly, those who think that diplomacy doesn't work are pointing to Iran, for example, as an area where perhaps a military strike would be in order, or at least a supportive strike with Israel. I want to bring into the discussion the role of the media.
Yeah.
We've talked about sort of the revolving door between generals and who are hired as these dispassionate on-air analysts, still serve either Pentagon interests or defense contractor interests. Glenn Greenwald of Salon had a great piece about a general who has been briefing NBC executives essentially about the imminent threat of Iran. How does this kind of thing affect diplomacy? I mean, affect foreign policy?
These generals come in, and a lot of these guys, I'm going to be very blunt here, as soon as they get their stars, they check their brain at the door, and they become part of the system which they came up through. The general you're talking about, I believe, reflects that. General McKean over at Fox is saying, McCaffrey, Keane, a lot of these guys will say whatever they're being told to say and have no ability to think for themselves. And that's part of the problem with the process. Don't get me wrong, there are generals out there, personal friends of mine who do think, who will say what's on their mind. But you have others who are actually engaged in this information operations, if you will, of trying to convince people things which aren't necessarily true or aren't in our country's best interest.
It doesn't seem to be working. I mean, what was that Pew poll that found that 58% of Americans would support a military strike against Iran if sanctions failed? I mean, our worldview is essentially reflecting these kinds of ideas.
And I
now.
think it's part of the problem. Let me just tell you about the blatant fact. The fact is you would have to take over 300 sorties, that is aircraft missions, to hit just the known sites within Iran. So where do we go from there? What's next? So we've got to be careful about how we do this. I'm not saying that there isn't not a threat. I think there are elements within the Iranian government would like to see something, but there's a rational side as well. They're not a monolithic threat. And that's why I believe we should actually try to encourage the Iranian people, the Persians, to rise up against their government, since they're not happy with the government either. But democratic change is ultimately the answer there, not bombing them back to the Stone Age.
But don't you think the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing out of, for example, our presidential hopefuls, some people in the political leadership, could essentially unify a country that feels like it's under attack? I mean, that's going to have the opposite effect.
Absolutely. I've said this on your network. I've said it on another network, too, that the more we poke them, the more their central government can see, we have enemies out there, you people need to be with us, and therefore we help codify that government and the people standing behind it. We would do the same thing here in the United States. If someone started taking shots at us, the Americans, we would form around the government and support it. This is one of the things we tend to forget about the fact if we do it to others, they're going to have the same effect of helping that government maintain control. Absolutely.
And one other thing that I want to get into, I mean, the new budget proposal makes it very clear that we're sort of shifting away from our focus on Iraq and our focus on Afghanistan, even though we're still expanding our bases and jails there, but that's a different conversation. Right. What kind of a void does that leave? I mean, Afghanistan is, by all metrics, a failure in terms of our mission,
despite
whatever the mission is.
The basic premise is this. They went in there to do counterinsurgency, which is basically to establish the conditions for the people to support the central government. What we've seen instead is us pushing the people towards a corrupt central government. They know it, and we give them a Hobson's choice. Either take the central government that's corrupt or the Taliban. Well, most people are picking the Taliban. That's why you saw 7 days of uprisings against us and the Karzai. We are a proxy of the Karzai. So the best thing we can do is this: accept the fact that we're not going to bring a 10th century people into the 21st century first. Secondly, the Karzai is corrupt. Let him sink or swim on his own. Third, the real issue has been, always has been, President Obama said it in his West Point speech 3 years ago, Pakistan. The Pakistanis still control the Taliban. I can tell you for a fact they do.
There's been recent reports.
Yes, another general, a good friend of mine, did a review in country recently and said the Taliban don't have sufficient mass to take over Afghanistan without the help of the Pakistanis. So the truth is we have to be focusing on Pakistan, plus Pakistanis have nuclear weapons. So all roads lead to Pakistan. Afghanistan should be left alone. We can do what's necessary there with special operations forces. We don't have to be occupiers to do what we have to keep national security interests at bay, not make them more like us.
Okay, well, a lot to talk about with the Pakistan issue, so I hope we can have you back in the near future to really hone in on that. Thank you so much for your time. That was Anthony Schaefer, the Senior Fellow at the Center of Advanced Defense Studies and the author of the book Operation Dark Heart.